Canada's parliament has backed the government's decision there to impose emergency powers to deal with weeks-long protest blockades against COVID restrictions. The motion, it was passed with 185 votes to 151 on Monday, with the support of the Liberals and the left-leaning party. Well, my next guest is a Canadian journalist who was tear-gassed while covering the trucker protests. Andrew Lawton joins me now. Andrew, welcome to you. We've talked to you several times in recent weeks. You've now suffered for your pains, it seems.
Yes, I should issue a slight correction. I don't know if it's much of an improvement. I was pepper sprayed, not tear gas, but either way, it was quite bananas at what was a very peaceful protest until the enforcement measures started.
Those enforcement measures have captured a lot of headline space around the world, Andrew. Sometimes it's difficult to get a perspective from a distance. I read, actually, I mean, we've had this conversation to and fro, as I say, in recent weeks, but you will read stuff here in London suggesting that actually there are lots of people in Ottawa who just wanted those freedom protests out of the way.
Yeah, that's certainly true. I mean, at the very beginning, the honking was particularly incessant, and there was a court challenge about that. The judge granted an injunction, and by and large, the honking stopped. And one of the other points that had developed in the last couple of weeks is the trucks that had been in residential areas, all in an agreement with the government, had moved downtown. Now, it was still disruptive. I'm not saying that at all, but the question is, did that disruption rise to the level of a national emergency, triggering what are ultimately wartime measures, and which, as you mentioned in your introduction there, the government is still insisting need to be in place for a blockade and a protest that at this point no longer exists.
Yeah, we were talking, I think, Andrew, last week, making the point that if you look, for instance, at some of the protests that have really irritated people in the UK recently, the Insulate Britain protests, you may have heard of them, people with an environmental agenda, blocking major arterial roads, busiest motorway in the country, the M25, police looking at times quite impotent to do anything about it. If the British government had invoked emergency powers reserved for terrorists, I think even people, like me, who were critical of the protesters' objectives, aims and tactics, would have thrown our hands up in the air and said, too far.
Yeah, I think you're right there. I mean, one of the leaders of this protest is in jail right now. She was denied bail by a judge this morning and is in jail indefinitely on a charge of mischief. You have a government that's still going after freezing bank accounts without a warrant, without even the accusation of a crime, of people that it says were connected to the protest in some way, with very broad latitude as far as how they apply that definition, and no legal recourse. So it is quite significant, and the implications of this for other protests are as well. But interestingly enough, even some of those who have supported the indefinite extension of this emergency have said, yeah, but it's different from when environmentalists are protesting. It's different when unions are protesting. Well, really? Just because you don't like this particular protest doesn't mean that you're not giving future governments that aren't on side with what you believe license to take the same approach to protests that are inconvenient to them.
The principle is the key thing, isn't it, in this as in all things. Andrew Lawton, so good to talk to you. Whatever the effects of the pepper spray were, they seem to have been more than adequately dealt with. Thanks very much indeed, Andrew. Nice to talk to you again.
Thank you.
Michael Portillo alongside me to reflect on Canada, if you can.
Yes.
And Justin Trudeau, poster boy for Liberals the world over, but making a bit of a hash of this, I think.
Well, absolutely. And what an irony that he has the epithet liberal. It really does alarm me. We've had 2 years of COVID and we've had 2 years of authoritarianism within democracies. And even when I was in Parliament, we were very wary of giving government powers, emergency powers, because, of course, any minister will say at the dispatch box in Parliament, these powers will only be used in these circumstances. And he'll be referring, no doubt, to terror or to war or something like that. But then, of course, governments, and even local governments in this country, have found it convenient to use powers that are there basically to counter terrorism, to counter things that they have found inconvenient. And that is what has happened in Canada. I'm very much in agreement with you. I was driven mad by the Extinction Rebellion people. Yeah, driven mad by them, and I wanted them off the streets. But if someone had said, oh, well, let's freeze their bank accounts, I would certainly have protested against that, because That just is not the right application of the right sort of measure.
Events in Canada have read like a parable. It wasn't just the apparent hypocrisy of Trudeau invoking some of these powers. When GoFundMe said, we will take the $9 million that have been donated to the truckers and we'll take it off them and we'll hand it to charities who we deem the appropriate recipients. They later revoked that idea. But all that sort of stuff from the wilder shores from the internet you read about tech running the world and having an agenda that's only aligned with one political perspective suddenly rang true.
And Andrew made a very important point there, didn't he? Which is that the blockade is finished. So, I mean, even if these emergency powers had been justified, which in my view, and I think yours, they were not, they're still in place even though the blockade has come to an end. I do think in general, there's a big competition in the world now between the authoritarian regimes like China and Russia and the liberal regimes, the democracies. And some of this is played out over COVID. And I think, for example, that we have done quite well. I know we've had a lot of deaths over COVID, but I think we have maintained a lot of freedoms and we're now returning quickly to freedom. A country like China is locked down. I don't know how it's ever going to get out of lockdown because its vaccines have not been very effective. It has a zero COVID policy. Zero COVID policy, in my view, is doomed to failure. So in all of this, we're going to learn lessons about the success of authoritarian regimes versus democracy. It's all part of this very important competition between two ways of seeing the world, two systems of government, one of which is accountable and one of which is not. And it's quite disappointing to find Canada at the moment in the wrong category.
Well, hopefully we'll talk how that impacts on COVID and some of the problems that revolve around that with democracy as well. Michael, for now, thanks very much indeed.